Rites of passage enables people to kind of direct this violence instead of being towards individual or whatever. It is towards lower aspect of men themselves. Sometimes it will be symbolized in animals, in objects, and so on and so forth, but it will be kind of integrated.
Good morning, David, or it's afternoon here in Europe, but I think 9 o'clock in the morning where you are over in Canada, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to introduce you quickly. So you are a historian specialized in Indo-European mythology and rituals. You're also a captain in the Canadian Infantry. You've been in the army for 12 years. And you're a contributor to the Symbolic World Blog with Jonathan Peugeot's project, which people who listen to me often hear that I am often mentioning that. Your day job as a computer scientist, and you've been helping me out with questions I have as I've been digging into ritual and understanding Victor Turner and Marie, all these different kinds of theories and stuff like that. And so we thought we're going to record a little recording here while we dig into some of these questions as well and share it with other people to see if that's relevant. So I'd just like to start off by hearing, did I mention your job as a computer scientist? That's your day job as well. Okay, I said that. Yeah, good. What was your, if we could start, what was your kind of entrance into getting interested in antiquity, history, and especially this kind of mythological ritual side of things?
Well, I've always been interested in history in general. Like since I was a teenager, I wanted to become either a historian or a teacher of history or something like that. And so I've always studied it on the side, but I was always a staunchly anti-religion, anti-Christian, atheist, and so on and so forth. But then at some point, I had a metanoia, a change of mind. And I, because of, life experience, reading some stuff and so on and so forth. And then as a young adult, I started getting more and more interested in it. And as I did so, I read works by Perinetus, like Guénon, Evola, so on and so forth, but also Mircea Eliade, however it's pronounced in English. And one of the fascinating things I found is that, the myths and legends and big narratives are not stories. I mean, they are also stories, but they are not just stories. They are something that needs to be participated in. They are, they only exist in this kind of complex web of relationship with humans and persons that participate in it and so on. And from then on, I started looking more at rituals. And that's also when I decided to go back to church, first as a Catholic and then as an Orthodox. But then, so it kind of led me towards reading more about it and so on and so forth. And at the same time, in university, you have to kind of choose topics for your thesis and so on and so forth. And so I decided to pick Indo-European kingship because kingship has always been something fascinating for me. Kind of the, in a sense, kingship, at least for antique tribes, has always been one of the best manifestation of male kind of spirituality and action in the world, in a sense. So I wanted to look more at kingship. And so I decided to choose a thesis that would look at it. So that's why I did my master thesis, for example, on Indo-European kingship and the ideology behind rituals, the various rituals that they perform, especially the horse sacrifice, but, just the kingship ideology in general. So it kind of led me towards there, starting from very far away from being, very anti-Christian and anti-religion to actually participating in rituals and myths and so on and so forth myself. So.
Yeah, lots of things to grab onto there. But the first thing that I think is, so for myself, Jordan Peterson, the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon was a big part of my following actually a similar path to you of going from a kind of very secular worldview to realizing the embeddedness of all things into a specific pattern of reality. And it seems like more and more people are experiencing that. And would you say then the heart of that is this understanding of kind of ritual or archetype or myth as a stepping stone into something that can kind of take us out of this nihilistic meaning crisis that we're in. Does that make sense? And do you also see a lot of people, is that in your circles also becoming more and more people taking that step?
I think so. I see a lot, either on various Discord groups or online groups or whatever. I mean, my parish is really small. We're like 10 people or something. So we rarely see new people. But for example, the last new guy that we had also was because of, Jordan Peterson. It's kind of almost a meme now, and the kind of, Jordan Peterson to Jonathan Pajot to Orthodoxy kind of path. So I feel that this crisis of meaning, or this meaning crisis or whatever, is kind of an impetus for people to kind of start thinking about deeper truths about the world, and the terms you mentioned, patterns, starting seeing patterns in myths, in rites, in relationship, and so on and so forth, is really strong. Not everybody ends up at the same place, either Orthodox or Catholicism or whatever, but I do think that it kind of woke something inside people, something deep, that kind of brought a refreshing perspective on religion and the role of religion and myths and rites and so on and so forth, because we're already striving to participate in narrative as individual, as persons. Whether it's just personal narrative, we construct our own narrative about our own life, and then we try to achieve that narrative. And when we don't, it actually kind of inflicts some kind of let's say moral injury on our ego and so on and so forth. But it's the same thing with our family narrative or our country narrative and so on and so forth. And so I think it's only normal that people at some point kind of ask themselves the question, well, what is the highest narrative, or what is the narrative of all the other narrative, in a sense? And this is where kind of modernity cannot provide anything for it. They can try and invent and push lower level narrative, but they cannot give access to higher narrative. And so I think that this is what religion of any kind, not just Christianity or whatever, it's just I do feel that Christianity is the best answer to that question, and that's why I'm a Christian. But I do feel that every kind of religion kind of answer that particular point.
Yeah, and then so as I've been diving into, and I think we're gonna try to dive into some of these names and these theories on this conversation. But I've been looking at, first of all, Victor Turner. Arnold van Gennep, of course, is the grand old man of the whole idea of rites of passage. Then René Girard is a name that just keeps on coming up in this whole area all the time recently. Maurice Bloch speaks specifically about violence through ritual. And then I've just been reading a little bit of a guy called Alexander Schmemann, who is a Russian Orthodox author who really puts the idea of ritual in a Christian context, so calls it liturgical theology, into a fantastic perspective. But I've kind of been surprised in going into this academic literature and just seeing, what I kind of first got a glimpse of through Jordan Peterson's language. Actually, Jordan Peterson, is very good at formulating things and getting it out to people like me. But these ideas are formulated in an even more systematic and complex, detailed way, which, I don't know, it feels almost like you've been following this path as well of kind of like nerding in a very intellectual way, but you choosing looking at kingship or the idea of the king. I'm wondering, has that also been a personal exploration for you in understanding those qualities and relevance for yourself and your own life?
Yeah, I think so, because I was gonna say I feel that, but in a sense, it's more than I feel. I think it's been written about a lot. But even in Christianity, for example, we are called upon to look at as Christ as our model, and Christ is both king and priest, and so we are called to be both priestly and kingly. Every human being is called to be kingly and priestly. And I do not mean to be a king or to be a priest. I mean to be kingly or priestly. And so therefore, looking at great example of priestly figure, and in my case, looking at example of kingly figure, personally is a great way of kind of getting more on par with this, understanding this kind of archetype in a sense, and trying to apply it even to our personal life,
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, because there's a guy, I don't know if you know, Alexander Bard is a very well-known speaker in our network, and he talks very much about like the separation of the king and the priest role and the importance of that. And this is also something that we see in most human societies as well, right? Is that by having these two separate parts of power, it was also part of the Byzantine Empire, for example. Actually, it was the emperor in the Byzantine Empire who also was the head of the church, right? But especially in the West, then we've had the separation. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how that fits at a societal level? Or is it different at a societal level and a personal level, or?
Yeah, well, it seems that our conception is really in the Middle Age. And the Middle Age conception, however, I do not want to say that it's untrue or whatever, but the separation is a much later factor, both from historical and spiritual perspective. Like, even if you take a look, for example, at the Bible, when Moses lead people out of Egypt, for example, he is both the king and the priest, he's the main leader. He's both the spiritual authority. He speaks with God and so on and so forth. And at the same time, he's also the temporal power, because he's the one that leads people. He gives order. He decides where they go, even leads attacks and so on and so forth. So he has both of those. But at some point, he has to break them down. And then that's where he breaks, Joshua and Aaron, the priest figure. And there is kind of a breakdown here of temporal power and spiritual authority. You can see this in many cultures. Like ancient Egyptian, for example, their king was also the priest, the high priest, because he was also a divine figure. In Indo-European culture, it's the same. The king is actually and that was my thesis, basically, where the king is the summation of everything in society, and the two higher aspect being king and priest. Basically, he is a king priest, And so in our days in age, we have a very clear separation of those two, which is one of the things that also kind of led to secularism in a sense, because we were able to kind of have functional societies with those two things separated. And though at some point we were able to say, well, the king, the state is above religion or above spirituality, and at some point you can just kind of make it go away and you just have the state, and that's it. But the problem with this is that even at the individual level, it's a matter of integration. The more you separate those two and the more you kind of push them out of the way, those two kind of let's say psychological archetype, the less you're going to be an integrated individual. And that's why I said that we're all called to be both kingly and priestly. We're not called to be this guy is called to be just kingly, just temporal oriented, and this guy is called to be just priestly. Of course, according to our own personal life and our own personal volition and capacity and so on, we're going to be at variance, But I feel that our modern society has pushed a little bit too much that division between the two.
Yeah. Okay. So so a lot of these authors and trying to make a segue from that. So as I read Victor Turner's, it's called The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure for the first time, then he also had, he came into his work as an anthropologist as an agnostic. He was down in Zambia and was like making like topographical maps of where the huts were and where the kinship lines were and the political systems and stuff like that. And then he says like there's this passage where he's like he couldn't ignore the drumming of the beating of the drums outside the village and seeing people going out there for these long periods of time. And so slowly got more and more interested and started embedding himself into these rituals or like going in a kind of more participatory way and seeing that maybe that's the priestly role somehow, that that connection into a separate approach, which or separate kind of sphere. He calls it the liminal sphere. Then, right? Is bringing these things together. So yeah, I'm wondering where do we get these needs fulfilled in our modern society? If in the secular society, is this? I mean, I've been thinking more and more about just like the television. That's like our altar. That's our liminal space. That's where we actually get our entertainment and experience this communitas somehow, or it's a poor substitution of the liminoid version of it, right?
Yeah,
Would you say that's correct?
I think that entertainment, it's a good point you bring out. I think that entertainment act more as a kind of opium for spiritual needs and so on and so forth, in the sense that it kind of, how can I say this in another sense? Like it's a little bit like if you stuff yourself with bread, let's say, like for example, I'm speaking of nutrition now, but if you stuff yourself with bread, you're going to still feel full, but you're going to be full of literally nothing, just a couple of carbs and maybe a bit of protein, but that's very, very little. If you only eat bread all day, every day, and so on and so forth, and you're going to be missing the core nutriments for your body. And I feel that entertainment, especially, kind of acts in the same way. It does not bring. It's not even a substitute of meat or a substitute of protein or anything. It's literally just a filling, because it kind of busy our psychology, our mental capacity, and so on. I think that where we can see kind of sub-actualization of the liminal space of communitas and of this rite of passage is in things that are a little bit more intense, like sports, for example. People in sports team, they're going to feel this bond, and they're actually in the liminal space, like when you have a team and you go, let's say a football team, and then you go for your training, there's always that kind of boot camp training in summer before the season begins, and so on and so forth, where everybody's at the same place, all working out, extremely strong, everybody has the same condition, and so on and so forth. It does feel like a communitas, and it's the same with sports events, is the same with many things. But where entertainment could get in is, for example, big raves or big parties and so on and so forth, where kind of all normal societal rules are abolished and everybody's kind of looked at on the same status and so on and so forth. And even the military, can be seen like that,
Yeah, they have very strong elements from these processes that give this strong experience. But would you say, like, if sitting in front of your television and bumming out, that's like just the very white bread, or maybe just eating sugar or something like that? And then sports, would you say that's maybe like a bit of a darker, more fiber-rich bread?
Yeah. Because there is something experiential about, let's say, a very intense sport. Or a very intense physical experience. There is something very tangible about it. It's a real experience. It's not just thinking about it or whatever. And the issue with those kind of, let's say, subliminal, I don't want to say subliminal because subliminal already means something, but let's say extra liminal experience of reality and so on, like, let's say, sports and so on and so forth, is that they are not complete. They because they're not, in a sense, they're not real, because they're not anchored on anything. The guy that go, let's say, to his communitas, his sports group and so on, and he does a special training with them, etc., he will not be changed by the end of it. He might be changed physically. He might still.
There are some elements of it, right? Like, you're getting a fellowship often with a group of people, and you're also
and discipline
maybe
and so on.
The integration of violence, if we're going to talk about Maurice Bloch, that also can come in there, right? So I go to judo, and I got to say, like, it just energizes me in such a way. And there's also, like, specific practices and rites in the judo class. Like, as I enter the room, I bow. As I go into the net, I bow. I bow to the teacher. So we're acting out specific elements of ritual practice that, it's not a full religion, but there's lots of, like, those lower level elements. But what you're saying really is that, like, only with a religion that has a cosmology and anthropology, that's what's going to actually give a full picture of a pattern that you can participate in as a human being, that will kind of be able to then create that structure or blueprint for knowing how to orientate yourself in life. Because,
like you say, like, the structure is there. Let's take for example, even a rite of initiation, let's say in university, some universities still do initiation and so on and so forth. So you start from some place, then you go through the initiation with a group of people. So you form some kind of bond with them, a communitas, and then afterwards you're accepted in the group. So the structure is there, but the function of it is not the same, because the people doing this, both those that are running it, the initiation, and the people doing it are not doing it in this, like you mentioned, with the same, let's say, superstructure, the same pattern and so on and so forth. There is a distinction between structures and function, and like those kind of low-level initiation or events and so on and so forth have the same structure, but they do not have the same function as a religious ritual, in a sense, And this is when both overlap. This is where the full experience can be kind of reach with all the consequence of it,
Okay. So in our network, the René Girard is a guy who we talk about a lot, and he speaks about the scapegoating mechanism that societies use, which is related to this. But also, it seems like looking at it from this kind of ritual anthropological perspective, there's a different thing that's happening. Can you try and illustrate what's that difference between, René Girard's ideas and then, Victor Turner and maybe especially Maurice Bloch's idea of that ritual as a way of integrating violence in a way that can be directed in a specific way for an individual?
Yeah, so René Girard, especially on the concept, let's say, of the scapegoating, his main idea is that there is a special form of ritualized violence, let's say, that can take place in society where we kind of we try to direct not necessarily our hatred or violence towards a goal, but instead we try to kind of redirect all our sins and our issues and our problems toward a scapegoat. In most societies, it's gonna be an individual or a group of individual, but it's gonna be something human because it needs to be kind of on the same level as us, so that we can kind of push it down, kind of dehumanize it, and then we can act upon it. Generally, acting upon it will be in the form of violence, exiling it, killing it, pushing it away, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then our woes that we sometimes self-inflict or just part of life, we're going to push them towards these people. And then this cycle of violence is kind of, is like we mentioned, is ritualized. But the issue and the difference is that in this case, it's a repeating cycle because the woes are never going to go away. I mean, society will always have sins and issues and problems and so on and so forth. So this kind of cycle of violence is self-repeating. And it does not change. If you scapegoat someone for something, you're going to scapegoat someone else for the same thing, a year from now and 2 years, 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the big point of René Girard is that Christ came to kind of be the sacrifice to end all the sacrifice, kind of end this cycle of violence with regards to scapegoating and so on. Mm-hmm. But what Maurice Bloch, for example, is saying is that in rituals of initiation, in various rituals, but mostly in ritual of initiation and rites of passage, the initiate is called upon to kind of make violence towards himself, at least towards a part of himself, the lower aspect of himself, the one that he wants to transcend to obtain this new status. Because, what rites of passage are is that they take you from one status, then you go into the liminal space, where you are kind of like we mentioned, communitas, no rules, everything goes, boot camp, whatever. And then from there on, you can learn your new status and you can participate in very specific and sometimes very dangerous rituals, which bring you to the post-liminal where you return to society, but with a new status. Mm-hmm. And what Maurice Bloch is saying is that rites of passage enables people to kind of direct this violence instead of being towards individual or whatever, it is towards lower aspect of men themselves. Sometimes it will be symbolized in animals, in objects, and so on and so forth, but it will be kind of integrated. And so this violence, through the rites of passage, is integrated into the human being, where he can direct this towards something else. And that is the big difference, let's say, between a scapegoating ritual and rites of passage, because both can denote violence and sometimes very dangerous violence. But the difference is that scapegoating does not provide a deeper functional change to human beings. They just kind of repeat the cycle over and over. Whereas in kinds of initiation, you're initiated after it's done.
Yeah, so one can see that the ritual of or a rites of passage is officiated or held by experienced elders who kind of see a bigger picture and understand the structure that's required to kind of move up the level. And is it Bloch who uses this formulation, something like the higher level spiritual colonizes or invades and colonizes the secular or the kind of the lower level life in some ways. And whereas the scapegoat is really just a ritual without elders. It's the gang kind of
mob mentality,
mob mentality things.
And it's a good point you bring out, because it's part of the violence also. because the example, for example, that Bloch takes where, it's the ancestor spirit that come to the village and they capture the children that are to be initiated, and then they steal them from their family and they go and they initiated. And there is this aspect of violence, like the aspect that the transcendent makes violence upon the immanent, and it's kind of part of what religion is about also, being able to manage that violence, because in a sense, no matter the religion you follow, God makes violence upon the world, in the sense that, he tries to but he is in the world, and there is a very kind of essential distinction between him and the world. And so the relationship between the two is kind of, I don't mean violence necessarily in like I say, in the negative sense. And that's also the point kind of Maurice Bloch wants to make, that violence can be, but in this case, he wants to show the scheme of violence. But from what we can gather from what he studied is that violence can be redirected. It can be aimed at something positive.
Yeah, well, I think it's very relevant for us today as well, because so Maniphesto, we work with men, we do events with men. And one thing I notice is, in myself and all other men I meet these days, is that we have anger, often large amounts of anger, and often unintegrated anger as well. And the more I look at it, it's like there's a narrative in society that like anger is bad. All anger we do is stop it and get rid of it, or not do it or whatever, right? And I have an idea that, it's like, well, anger, you could say anger is a God-given gift in order to be able to establish boundaries and to say no and to stop something that's damaging and harmful. And then when it is not expressed at appropriate times, it has this tendency to become toxic, and then it can come out at the wrong times and be used inappropriately as well. And so if we're looking at these theories from like Girard, and, I guess what Maurice Bloch is saying like there were these elements of integration of violence, even a Christian sense of integration of violence in even some pagan or more primitive societies that were kind of pointing towards maybe smaller versions of the Christs, that revolution that Girard actually explains, right? So, this is one of the challenges that I've had actually in doing the work that I'm doing now, because, most of the men who come to my events are not Christians. Most of them are not interested in Christianity really, or, the most they'll have a slightly academic interest in Christianity or something like that. They've heard some Jordan Peterson, stuff like that. As you know, Jonathan Peugeot came to the European Men's Gathering last year, and he actually faced quite a bit of heat with people saying like, what are you doing going to this like weird pagan thing with all these like non-Christian people and stuff like that as well. And so I don't know, what do you think is the solution to that? Because, we have a situation today where it seems like there aren't many other ways of dealing with this issue of the violence inherent in all of us. And, in mainstream society, it's not allowed to express it. But at the same time, it's like, it seems like the passages for dealing with this are closed to a lot of people. So I don't know. Yeah. What any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to necessarily go into the personal aspect, because, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist or whatever, but at least from, let's say, a social or religion perspective, I think one thing that's interesting is, and we spoke about it already earlier, is that the integration of violence is not sublimation or destruction of anger or violence, whatever term we want to use in this case. It's an integration of that anger, aiming it at the right place for the right reason. And on that, if we take the Christian example, just because it's going to be easier to show in this case, but what this rites of passage that Maurice Bloch is speaking about in his book, about kind of making violence upon the lower aspect of man by killing a pig and so on and so forth. This aspect, is replicated in Christianity. When monk speaks that we should do war against the flesh, even St. Paul says this, making war against the flesh. It's not necessarily about, going outside and start cutting your body or whatever, because your physical body is not the flesh as it is understood. The flesh is all the lower aspect of our body, but also our psychology and so on and so forth, And so we are called upon, for example, as Christian, to kind of redirect that anger and that violence towards the flesh, towards this world, as it is understood as a world of sin and so on and so forth. And so this is one aspect already that I think can be very satisfying, is that integration of violence or integration of anger needs to have the right aim, because integrating it by saying it should go away, well, as you pointed out, will not work, So it needs to be integrated. And this second aspect also is that, you mentioned that in our society, we try to push away anger or tell people not to express anger and so on and so forth. And I feel that one of the reasons why this is so is that we are trying to attack personhood and personhood expression of anger, because anger as a social indignation or as a mob rule is actually encouraged, like cancel culture or just, expression of mob violence and so on and so forth, manifestation, etc., is actually encouraged, because and it's kind of it's very dangerous, because, like I say, it's an abandonment of personhood, of individuality, in favor of a mob violence. And it kind of brings us back to René Girard, And this is also a point that we didn't point out earlier, but I think is also important. René Girard's scapegoat mechanism is a mob thing, whereas a rite of passage where you integrate violence or anger in your person is an individual thing. And I'm not saying this as an individualist, that's not the point. The point is not that the individual is the measure of everything, but my point is that those kind of things are at the person level. That personhood is important, Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering what are the practical implications of that in the ritual? Like, does that look different in the ritual? Like, how does one have a ritual where the individual personhood has space to come to expression? So we have like a ritual at the European Men's Gathering, where it's called the death of the patriarchs. And what we do, we see this narrative of like toxic masculinity and the patriarchy as the source of all evil. And so we say, okay, well, let's take that and live it out, actually. So we actually have some elders, and we took an Orthodox priest last year, Father Michael Butler, and we actually both ritually burnt and stoned him in a ritual where we kind of enacted this this Girardian mob in some ways, but there were also elements where we attempted to make sure that we were creating an awareness of this. But the real awareness actually came the next morning when Jonathan then went onto the stage and kind of said, like, what are you guys doing? Like, why are you even here? if you're killing the patriarchs, like, what is this idea of like the father, and, why are you, so for different people, the realizations came at different times, obviously. But yeah, so my question is how does one ensure that individuality and personhood can come to, that there's a space for that, and it's not just a copying the most charismatic leader, or whatever feels to be the gender of the day kind of thing. Virtue signaling, I guess, is a big part of it as well, right? Yeah.
Well, the individual, like the personhood aspect, I think I think it's a difficult question, especially with rites of initiation and so on and so forth, because we have a very big tendency in our Western modern rites of passage, and I mean this at the lower level, let's say like we spoke about earlier, like sports or university and so on and so forth. There is very much a loss of personhood, whereas in a sense, the traditional view of rites of passage is about acquiring actual personhood. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure that in Maurice Bloch, children are not actually considered full person. Until they are
they're kind of animal-like. They're seen and represented or symbolized by the pigs as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I think it's important that true rites of passage, at least, should have this aspect. And if you ask the question how it can be done, well, that's a very difficult question. I mean, if we take a look, let's say, at another rites of passage very far away, let's take Japan with Shugendo. They climb a mountain as a group, and there is all that, communitas aspect and so on and so forth. But when they reach the peak of the mountain, and it is also where there is the peak of the rites itself, and so on, they take people one by one, and they plunge them they tie them to a rope, and they plunge them over a precipice, and then as they are basically, this from falling to their death, that's where they kind of really, like I say, it's really like the ritual itself is kind of made like a mountain, a mountain tip. And so when they reach that highest point, this is where everything kind of changed in the person, because that's where they ask them basically to confess their sin, to say that they will be changing their life, that they will be now, good to their family, good to their parent, good to their community, and so on and so forth. And because of the fear of being there and all the travel and all the prayers and all the build-up and so on and so forth, at that precise moment, they are between life and death. That's where they choose basically life, and then they come back up and they are changed, And I'm not saying that everything needs to be necessarily one-on-one or whatever, but what I think is that this personhood aspect, it cannot necessarily go through a mob. If the ritual is mob oriented, it will have mob-like consequence and so on and so forth. And if the question at large of personhood, well, for example, in Christianity, every time we go to receive the Eucharist, it is a personal relationship that we have with Christ. It's not mediated. It's nothing. We literally take the body and the blood of Christ. There is nothing between us and Christ at that precise moment. And that's why this is the pinnacle of the Christian liturgy, for example, and this is where we can kind of work toward that personhood, at least as Christian, because we have a sense of, building personhood is about, speaking with someone else, or et cetera, et cetera. But anybody, for example, that has a wife or a kid or whatever, that sometimes you don't talk, and yet you feel this web of relationship with the other person and so on and so forth. And so it is the same thing. We participate in Christ. We don't need to necessarily speak with him or him to speak with us, and we still build that personal relationship,
Yeah. Makes me think of Matthew Pageur's book, The Language of Creation, and this idea of a hierarchy that can integrate all of the lower aspects inside without destroying any of the unique individuality of all of the constituent parts. And, when we have this event, then we ask people to do difficult, challenging, and even sometimes some slightly morally dubious things, that are within the narrative of the event. And people rebel and they fight against, and there's this constant need to be able to balance. How do we make sure that these people are able to express themselves and be fully human, but at the same time also make sure we're not just a group of fragmented individuals all facing off in our own directions, and there's no actual kind of movement towards that actual summit of the mountain, right? So that balance, I guess it's never going to happen in a human designed ritual. That's the impossibility of it, right? But still, we need these things. I'm a member of sports clubs. I'm a member of a small little town here, and there are many hierarchies I have to be a part of that we need to understand how to integrate more and more, so we're at a time where, just having a few mid-level or lower level, like, micro level or meso level hierarchies that actually work can be even a more and more privilege. I mean, so everywhere I look now, and the people who I respect most are talking about apocalyptic times and a fragmentation, a collapse, a kind of a zombification or a desolation, a flattening of everything. And so, and I think more and more, especially as you look online as well, then, the communities that are forming are, often there's a very strange idea of what's up in these communities. It can be all kinds of really just fetishizations of weird and wonderful and strange things somehow. And so in the online space, to find that kind of integration and fitting together in a better pattern is good.
Yep.
Great. So yeah, we're gonna have to end in 3 minutes, David. It's just been a really good talk. Really, I'd be certainly up for continuing this maybe in the future.
It was fun.
Yeah, but thanks very much. Maybe we just say that was that.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really good talking to you. And we'll be in touch. Cheers.
Yeah, see you. Thanks.